So if your mixes still aren't translating the way that you want them to, then there are several different reasons why that could be the case. One of those reasons, though, is that you're lacking clarity inside of your mix. And this is the separation of various elements inside of your mix. So we're going to be diving into a mix on exactly how I create that inside of my mixes, and hopefully you find it helpful as well. And if you stick around until the end, then I'm going to show you the step-by-step process that I follow and the checklist, essentially, that I follow to create this clarity using a technique that I like to refer to as relational EQ. All right, so we're finally moving on to the last stage of EQ, which is relational EQ. So let's go all the way back to the beginning here, and we've come all the way here to enhancing dynamics. Now we're on to relational EQ. So we're almost to the fun stuff, which is the effects, but we're very, very, very close to finishing up this mix. So let's dive into the relational EQ. This is the most important part after volume balance and dynamic processing. It's probably more important than dynamic processing, honestly, because we're creating clarity in the mix right now. And that clarity comes from creating lanes in the mix that each element is going to be able to be seen as its best self inside of the mix. Because if we have our lead guitar and our rhythm guitar, and they're both living in the same exact area in the mix, they're going to cover each other up, and we're not going to hear either of them. And there's going to be no clarity. It's going to sound muddy. Even if it's well sonically balanced, right, which we've been talking about a lot, if it's well sonically balanced, it's not going to be muddy because of the buildup of mid-range, but it's going to be muddy because there's not going to be any clarity in the mix because everything is blending together too much. So there's a very fine balance between blending things and gluing them correctly versus creating masking. So gluing is normally referred to as, is normally talking about dynamic processing because they move together dynamically speaking. So mix bus compression is gluing the mix together because everything moves together dynamically speaking. So it's compressing everything at the same time. Versus clarity is created through EQ and separating items frequency-wise, not dynamically. So some people get rid of those really confused because separation is a really good thing to have in your mix, but they're like, well, aren't I supposed to be gluing things together? And inherently, yes, both are true. One is talking about dynamics, the other is referring to frequencies. Okay, let's get back to the mix here, and we're talking about drums. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to start with relational EQ is the low end, and then I'm going to work myself up the frequency spectrum. The reason I do this is because the frequency spectrum is kind of like a V, like an upside down pyramid when it comes to amount of space in the mix. The higher we get, the closer those frequencies are together in terms of I can boost something at 6.9 kilohertz and also at 7 kilohertz, and there's going to be some separation there because they're 100 hertz apart. And we can tell that very easily. Versus in the low end of the mix, if I boost something at 50 hertz and then boost something else at 55 hertz, there's 5 hertz of separation between those two, which is basically not any separation at all. So I need to be very, very detailed in what I allow to exist in the low end and also how I'm EQing it. So the two main elements in this mix that we have, which is very normal, is our kick and our bass, which we need to separate using EQ. So I'm going to throw on my handy dandy EQ channel here. I'm going to look at the bass as well. Throw on another EQ here. And we can now look at each one of these individually. So here's the kick. So I can kind of see where it's living on here. I can also use this analyzer too because it's pretty apparent. But there's actually quite a bit of a separation already in these two elements. What you're looking at here, right, is the fundamental of the bass overall, which is sitting around this 100 hertz region, generically speaking. So we're just going to boost that a little bit, and then we're going to cut at that 50. There's very actual little overlap that's happening here. But I want to just ensure that there's nothing that's going to hinder my kick and my bass from living in that low end happily together. There's really more invasiveness of the kick into the bass versus the bass into the kick. If you see, there's nothing really at this 52 hertz region for the bass, so I'm pretty safe. But there is a lot of this 100 hertz still building up, so I'm just going to continue to cut that to build that separation. And then we're going to do a slight boost out the fundamental of the kick. Just enough to keep that present. And then I'm going to boost right here at this like 350 on the bass because I am recognizing that there's actually room in the mix around that area. You know, not a ton, but there's definitely some, and the snare's kind of living in that area, but there's definitely some room for this bass there as well. So I'm just adding a little bit more there. So the guitars are the next lowest after the bass. And the way that we can tell if there are any masking frequencies inside of the mix is we can go through and pay attention to one element. And then we can mute every other element to see if it pops out in the mix. So let's listen to our guitars and go through this exercise. So listen to just the guitars, and if they pop out of the mix when I mute something, that means there's some sort of masking going on. So here we go. Let's go to the chorus here. I just wanted to say, there's a little bit there, but not much. I just wanted to say, was I just stuck in your way? So a little bit with the vocal. I'm not as concerned about the vocal because I'm gonna favor the vocal over the guitars anyway. But the leads is kind of the major area, maybe a little bit with the bass. The bass is pretty loud in this mix overall, so that's another. I just wanted to say. I'm not terribly concerned about that, but just one thing I'm noticing here. So let's add an EQ to these guitars here, and let's do that in dual mono still. I just wanted to say. And they're cutting through the mix a little bit better. So part of the reason I'm doing this is to try to figure out where the guitars are naturally living anyway inside of the mix. So the way that I would do this from scratch, if I wasn't sure, I just wanted to say, was I just stuck in your way? So I can tell, like right around here, they poke out of the mix a lot because there's not as much stuff living there, but they don't sound they don't sound like a guitar. It sounds like a muddy guitar. And so not really the vibe that I'm going for. But right around here, right around this kind of 2K range, I can tell they're popping out of the mix decently well, and they also have the tone that I'm going for as well. I just wanted to say. Yeah, so right at that 2.2 is exactly where that is. And it makes sense because that's where I've already boosted them. So generally speaking, we can kind of follow that as a rule of thumb of like, if I boosted here already, tonally speaking, then I can probably go a little bit further, another 3 dB or so, and be pretty safe. So that's the guitars. Again, we're leading into, they're being masked by the bass and the leads. So the bass. So my guess is they're probably fighting for space, mostly in this low range here. So I'm going to grab another band and that 260 range, as I'm going to do a cut. I mean, pretty narrow here. Yeah, there's also just like a little bit more space for that guitar to live. That is exactly what I wanted to happen with that move. The other area I'm concerned about, though, is this upper range, and I might just need another EQ for this bass. Just add another one. Fine. Yeah, because the bass is really strong right there, too. But let's go back to this like 1 point. It's usually more about cutting than boosting here anyway. And then the leads now kind of feel like they're underwater. So because if I listen to just the leads, I just wanted to say. So there's definitely masking going on between the guitars and the rhythm guitars and the leads here. So it's yet another layer here that we gotta address. We're looking here. I kind of avoided doing any cuts here. So let's, the 1.7 was where the bass was kind of living. So let's cut there. I just wanted to say, was I just stuck in your way? I found out. And then the leads are living. And that 1.7. Okay, we got a problem. I just wanted to say, was I just stuck in your way? Because all my guitars are living in the same exact area, including my bass. So that's not good. And then this guy is going to get cut here. Go -2 decibels. I just wanted. Was I just stuck in your way? I found out I was talking to a liar. Find yourself here causing a say. It seems like it was over nothing. I found out I was talking to a liar. Go tell stories like you wouldn't believe, but don't blame. I just wanted to say, was I just... Okay, because my bass... okay, that bass was originally like 1.4, so let's try that instead on this 1.4, and then our leads can move up a little bit. Well, and this guy can go down to 1.7. I'll do another one at 2.3. There we go. I think everybody's going to live happily ever after here. And so I'm just I'm making this cut right here just to avoid that fundamental of the bass. That's what that is all about. Okay, I think I got everything that I needed to. Bass is living. One. Double check here. Oh. It's 1.3. Let's just, yeah. This EQ curve's getting a little messy, but. Okay, so I'm making a little bit of room for those guitars in the vocal, right? Because they're all living right around here. So let's actually just remove that one. I just wanted to say, was I just stuck in your way? I found out I was talking to a liar. Find yourself here causing a scene. Seems like it was over nothing. I found out I was talking to a liar. Go tell stories like you wouldn't believe. Don't blame. I just wanted to. It's a very simple arrangement. As we get more and more complex, more different instruments, then that's when this whole process of mixing with relational EQ gets really, really complex. So if we're adding, violins and harps and synths and, counter melodies and all those different things, that's when we're getting really, really complex into how difficult it is to mix because of this relational EQ item specifically. So the last thing I want to do is just a little bit of harmony. I just want to double check to make sure these aren't going to be running into anything. So it's really living at this like 600. So I'm going to cut basically everything but this. Just a little, that was way too much. Just a little bit to avoid any harm in the rest of the mix. Pun intended. All right. Yeah. That's as easy as a relational EQ gets pretty much, unless you have like a simple mix with like a piano and vocal or something like that. But overall, like this, as a full band, this is a pretty straightforward mix. So I'm happy about that. It's turned out good so far. Okay, so let's dive into clarity, what creates clarity, and ultimately just the step-by-step process that I think through this process that you just saw inside of this mix. So when we're creating clarity in the mix, the first question I ask myself is, what are the common octaves? What are the elements that share fundamental frequencies that will likely have some sort of overlap of masking that will lead to an unclear or lack of clarity in my mix? So the common octaves, the easiest and lowest hanging fruit is always the kick and the bass, because they share the same low frequencies that are inevitably going to overlap to some extent. We can create additional clarity in the low end just by creating one lane for each of those elements. Similar to the guitar and potentially lead guitar. So if we're doing octaves on the lead guitar, that's probably going to clash with the rhythm guitar as well, because they could be even in the same exact range, the same exact frets that are used to play those two things. So that would be another example of needing to have some additional clarity because of this common octave that is shared. Another example is vocals will often share a common octave with rhythm guitars or lead guitars as well. So that's another, overlap. Most rock mixes are kind of terrible about this because every single element is so saturated and distorted that they're going to live everywhere across the frequency spectrum already anyway. And so you essentially need to perform this activity for every single thing in the mix. As you just saw, I had to do that for everything in the mix. Even though this was a very straightforward mix, there's not very many elements in it, I still need to do quite a bit of work with this relational EQ to create this separation. So, which is the next way to identify these elements that are being masked is the mute method. Listening to one element, muting other buses and other groups of tracks to see when it pops out. When it pops out, then I know that there's masking happening, but that still leaves the question, where do I actually boost and cut? Or maybe I can't really tell if it's popping out. Maybe I can hear it more, but does that mean it's popping out or not, right? So the next method to be able to identify for sure if there's actual overlapping frequencies that are masking each other is the analyzer method. So this is actually just pulling up an analyzer, looking at one element, looking at another element, and seeing if they overlap. For example, we have a rhythm guitar and a lead guitar right here. This was in a real mix, not the mix that you just saw, but similar. There's a rock mix, and we overlap those two things, and you combine them. There's a lot of masking that's happening here, and so we have the blue is the rhythm guitar, the yellow and orange is the lead guitar. You can see that the lead guitar is almost completely masked by the rhythm guitar, and so we definitely need to dive in here and actually make some adjustments here. So in this mix, I would probably start looking at boosting the lead guitar around that 1K range because it has some strength there. But if I boost at the 2 to 3K range, I'm going to completely sacrifice the rhythm guitar, because the rhythm guitar needs some sort of that aggressiveness, that forwardness to be able to even cut through the mix by itself. So I don't want to sacrifice the rhythm guitar. So that lead guitar is probably going to live in that 800 to 1 kilohertz range. And then that's going to create those two lanes for those two elements. So the rhythm guitar is going to live at 2K, the lead guitar is going to live at 1K, and now we have two different lanes for these different elements that they can actually exist in harmony inside of the mix instead of clashing like they currently are in this example. So this is how analyzers can really help us, because ultimately the goal, right, is to create a mix that kind of looks like this. There's a clear lane for every single element in the mix. This is what most mixes look like when we're diving in. Even up to the point where we started this video was we had already done tonal EQ, so each element sounded relatively good on just frequency wise. We had already done compression, so we'd already compressed things so they're kind of in their little box on the wall, essentially, if you will, but they're still running into each other frequency wise. And so that's why this relational EQ step is so necessary inside of our mixes. But this is essentially what happens when we have this lack of clarity in our mix, because not every element has its own lane. We don't know where it's traveling, and ultimately we run into massive issues like this. So that leads us to the last step, is where do I boost and cut on these various elements? And so once we've identified where the masking is occurring, we have the element that's being masked, and then we have the offending element that is masking that element. And it could be both ways too, because we could have a very strong lead guitar and a very strong rhythm guitar that are both masking each other. You can't really distinguish either of them in the mix. So it could be both ways, and it could be one way. So maybe the vocals are masking the rhythm guitars, but the rhythm guitars are not masking the vocals. So that could be the case as well. But once we identify what element is being masked, then we want to use the sweep EQ. And this is similar to what you'll see a lot of people teaching how to do EQ, is just like sweeping across the spectrum and seeing what sounds good. But it's different in the fact of we're not listening to what sounds good, because what sounds good? If you don't have trained ears, you're not going to know that. So it's just kind of it's an asinine question. Pardon my language. But the point is to have a small bell, have about 5 decibels of gain increase on your bell curve, and just kind of sweep across the frequency spectrum. Usually there's going to be 1 or 2 places that pops out of the mix. So you're going to be able to clearly hear the element that you're trying to boost. That is the area that there's room for that element to exist inside of the mix. The other things I'm going to look at, because again, even the sweep EQ, if you're not used to mixing and you don't have very good trained ears yet, you still might really struggle with this concept. And so I would go back and look at the analyzer and see where are these things already strong, because those are really good indicators of I can create a lane for this element in this space. So if you look at the lead guitar on the right, you'll see that it's already really strong at that 800 hertz region. So maybe that's a good lane for that to already exist inside of the mix. I can try to boost there, and then if my lead guitar is then cutting through, then it is a way to be able to create the lead guitar. Granted, you might then have to change directions on other elements, because if say I had a background vocal that was living right at that area that then is then masking, right? So we're creating issues at the same time as we're solving them. And so it's a systematic process of going through and identifying where the masking exists, and then creating a lane for each single element inside of the mix. So then we end up with a very clear sounding mix where each element has its own space to live. The one thing I want to warn you against is don't just do like high and low passes and only exist in one tiny area, because that's definitely not going to work out the way that you think it would. Occasionally, if you have a background element, that does work really well, but it's not going to work on your lead vocal if it's only existing at 1.5 kilohertz. It's going to sound like it's in a telephone box. So that's not the way to approach it most of the time. But the sweep EQ can be really helpful if you are confident a little bit with frequencies and to identify where it's actually popping out in the mix. That's the kind of the last step to be able to create clarity in the mix and identify where to boost it if you're not sure, even after looking at the analyzer for your elements that are being masked and also masking that element. Okay, with that, thanks for watching. If you haven't already gotten my book, I highly recommend picking up The Objective Mix. If you're struggling at all with your mixes, this is going to get you to the industry standard just with the information contained in the book. I've had amazing results from people who have read the book, so it's super cheap. If you want it, click on the link right down below this video, because it's epic. And I put a lot of time and effort in making sure that it's an actually really great book to help you practically inside of your mixes. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.